Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The sound of the bulldozer echoed through Michael Anderson's backyard on an October morning in Fairview, Connecticut, through the window of his home office. He watched with growing concern as members of the Oakwood HOA construction crew methodically removed the soil near the border of his property. The vibration made his coffee cup shake on the table, spilling a few drops onto the contract he was reviewing. Michael was a respected 45-year-old architect who had carefully chosen his property precisely because he was not part of any homeowners association. He valued his independence and the freedom to make decisions about his own home without outside interference. The 2-acre plot with its 3-bedroom colonial house represented everything he had ever wanted: privacy, space, and autonomy. As he watched the going sun, he noticed Susan Reynolds, the HOA director, overseeing the work with her perfectly groomed gray hair and traditional authoritative posture. Susan was known in Fairview for her uncompromising management of the Oakwood HOA, a gated community that bordered Michael's property. "Gentlemen, do you have permission to do this work?" Michael asked, approaching the edge of his property. The excavator operator paused his work, but Susan quickly intervened. "Mr. Anderson, we are carrying out necessary improvements to our infrastructure. This doesn't concern you," she replied with an artificial smile. "The area in question belongs to Oakwood." Michael frowned, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket. "I have serious doubts about that, Mrs. Reynolds. My documents clearly show that this area is within the boundaries of my property." "Your documents must be out of date," Susan retorted, dismissing her concerns with a gesture. "Get on with the job," she ordered the team. Over the next few weeks, Michael discovered that the improvement had directly affected his gas line. With the arrival of winter, his heater began to show problems, and the gas company confirmed that the supply was compromised due to the recent infrastructure changes. Her attempts to talk to Oakwood management were systematically ignored. Unanswered emails, unreturned phone calls, and registered letters returned unopened. The situation was becoming untenable. It was during a thorough search of his property documents that Michael made a surprising discovery. The original site plans revealed that the Oakwood HOA's main sewer line had been illegally crossing his property for years without any formal agreement or compensation. Michael decided to seek legal help at his office in downtown Fairview. Attorney Richard Martinez listened intently as he examined the documentation presented. "This is more common than you might think," Martinez commented, adjusting his gold-framed glasses. "HOAs often overstep their bounds literally and figuratively, but you have a solid case here." The strategy developed by Martinez was clear: use the discovery of the sewer line as leverage to force the HOA to correct the damage done to the gas line and establish clear boundaries for future interventions. "Mrs. Reynolds," Michael began in his next attempt to contact, this time accompanied by Martinez, "I believe we have urgent matters to discuss regarding certain shared infrastructure." Susan's face paled slightly as she noticed the lawyer's presence. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Anderson. Let me refresh your memory," Martinez interjected, opening his briefcase. "We have complete documentation here showing that Oakwood's main sewer line illegally crosses Mr. Anderson's property. Considering the recent unauthorized modifications that have affected his gas supply, I believe it's in everyone's best interest to find an amicable solution." The initial confrontation evolved into a series of tense meetings between the parties. The situation attracted the attention of other residents in the area, especially those who had also faced problems with Susan's authoritarian management. Carol Martinez, an Oakwood resident for 5 years, approached Michael after one of the meetings. "You know, this isn't the first time Susan has acted like this. Last year, she tried to force the removal of the century-old tree from the Williamsons' garden, claiming that it compromised the aesthetics of the community." Pressure began to mount on the HOA board. Other residents began to question previous decisions, and old documents were unearthed revealing a pattern of questionable behavior on the part of management. During a tense HOA board meeting, which Michael was invited to attend, Susan finally gave in. Upon careful review of the situation, she announced with visible discomfort, "The board recognizes the need to re-evaluate certain recent decisions." The final agreement included not only the immediate correction of the damage to Michael's gas line, but also a formal agreement on the sewer line with retroactive compensation for the unauthorized use of his property. Most importantly, it established clear protocols for any future work near the property boundaries. As he watched the technical team restoring his gas line, Michael reflected on how a simple property dispute had turned into something bigger. It wasn't just about defending his rights, but also about establishing clear and fair boundaries in a community where the balance between individual and collective rights had to be constantly negotiated. As the dispute with the Oakwood HOA intensified, Michael decided to do a more thorough investigation of his property. He hired Gerard Thompson, an experienced local surveyor known for his meticulous work on property disputes. On a cold November morning, Gerard arrived with his state-of-the-art equipment and a team specializing in underground mapping. "Mr. Anderson, we'll need a few hours to do a complete survey," Gerard explained, adjusting his GPS equipment. "Considering the situation with the gas line, I want to check all the underground utilities." During the investigation process, Gerard made a disturbing discovery. In addition to the sewer line that illegally crossed Michael's property, there were other undocumented infrastructures. A complex network of pipes and cables had been installed over the years without any official registration or authorization. "This is much worse than we imagined," commented Gerard, showing Michael a three-dimensional digital map. "See these lines in red? These are all unauthorized Oakwood installations. They've practically turned your land into a utility hub." Michael felt his stomach turn. The situation was more serious than he had imagined. With the evidence in hand, he made an urgent appointment with his lawyer Thomas Wright at the law office located in the historic center of Fairview. Thomas examined the reports with growing interest. "Michael, this completely changes the game," said Thomas, removing his reading glasses. "We're no longer just talking about an isolated violation. This is a systematic pattern of trespassing that stretches back for years." During the investigation, Michael began to receive calls from other homeowners in the area. Carol Bennett, a retired teacher who lived on the other side of Oakwood, shared a similar story. "They did the same thing to me 3 years ago," Carol revealed, sitting on her balcony with a cup of tea. "They installed a transformer on my property without permission. When I questioned it, Susan Reynolds said it was for the good of the community." News of the investigation began to circulate around the neighborhood. Richard Knowles, an investigative journalist for the Fairview Chronicle, contacted Michael, interested in exploring a larger pattern of questionable behavior on the part of the HOA. "I've received several complaints about Oakwood over the past few years," Richard explained during an interview in his file-crammed office. "But I've never had enough concrete evidence to publish anything substantial." Meanwhile, Susan Reynolds stepped up her pressure campaign. Threatening letters began to arrive suggesting that Michael was damaging the harmony of the community. Other HOA board members began making unsolicited visits to his property, always with vague excuses about routine inspections. Michael meticulously documented every interaction. He installed strategically placed security cameras and kept a detailed log of all intimidation attempts. His home office became a command center with maps, legal documents, and photographic evidence covering the walls. One afternoon, while reviewing the recordings from the security cameras, Michael noticed something intriguing. An Oakwood maintenance team had tried to access his property during the night, apparently to carry out some kind of unauthorized work. "This is unbelievable," he muttered to himself, immediately sending the recordings to Thomas Wright. The lawyer replied promptly, "Michael, this is exactly the kind of evidence we needed. They are clearly in violation of several state and municipal laws." The tension reached its peak during an HOA board meeting where Michael was invited to present his concerns. Oakwood's community room was packed with curious and concerned residents, filling every available seat. "What we see here," Michael began, projecting the maps and evidence onto a large screen, "is a systematic pattern of property rights violations, not just mine, but potentially several other landowners in the region." Susan Reynolds, sitting at the main board table, kept her expression impassive, but her fingers drumming on the table betrayed her nervousness. Other council members exchanged worried glances. "These accusations are completely unfounded," Susan declared, her voice trembling slightly. "All our actions are approved by the board and follow proper procedures." It was at this point that Brandon Martinez, a new council member and retired civil engineer, intervened. "Mrs. Reynolds, with all due respect, these maps clearly show violations of city regulations. As a professional in the field, I can't ignore that." The meeting became a turning point. Other residents began to speak up, sharing their own experiences with the HOA administration. What began as an individual dispute was turning into a larger movement for transparency and accountability. Thomas Wright, watching discreetly from the back of the room, smiled. The strategy was working better than expected. The pressure was no longer just coming from Michael, but from the whole community. As the meeting drew to a close amid heated discussions, Michael realized that his struggle had become something bigger than himself it was. No longer just about his gas line or illegal pipes, it was about setting a precedent of responsibility and respect for property rights throughout the community. Tension in the Oakwood community reached its critical point when Susan Reynolds called an emergency council meeting. The community room was packed with anxious residents, many of whom had begun to question the legitimacy of the HOA's actions after Michael Anderson's revelations. "This is a direct attack on the integrity of our community," Susan declared, her voice shaking with indignation as she gestured toward the documents projected on the screen. "Mr. Anderson is distorting facts for his own benefit." Michael, sitting in the front row next to his lawyer Thomas Wright, remained calm as he watched Susan try to control the narrative. The meeting quickly turned into a verbal battleground when Brandon Martinez, the council's retired engineer, stood up to speak. "I have here," Brandon announced, holding up a folder of documents dating back to 1985 that show the HOA was aware of the property violations from the beginning. "As an engineer, I can attest that these facilities were deliberately hidden from official records." A murmur of outrage ran through the room. Patricia Henderson, a 70-year-old resident who had lived at Oakwood since its foundation, stood up with difficulty, leaning on her cane. "I remember when they installed those pipes." Her frail voice carried surprising strength. "At the time I questioned the council, but they told me everything was in order. Clearly, we were all fooled." Patricia's revelation sparked an avalanche of similar testimonies. Residents began to share their own experiences of Susan's authoritarian administration, creating a worrying picture of years of mismanagement and abuse of power. During this uproar, Michael noticed something interesting. Margaret Wilson, the council's secretary for 15 years, discreetly left the room, carrying a pile of documents. His instincts alerted him, and he silently signaled Thomas. "Right. We need those files," whispered Thomas. "Something tells me they're trying to destroy evidence." Michael quickly sent a message to Richard Knowles, the investigative journalist who was covering the case. In a matter of minutes, Richard appeared in the association's parking lot just in time to photograph Margaret loading boxes of documents in her car. The situation took an even more dramatic turn when Janet Cooper, a young accountant recently hired by the HOA, approached Michael after the meeting. Her hands shaking, she handed over a flash drive. "I found irregularities in the accounts," she whispered, nervously looking around. "Years of misappropriation of funds for infrastructure maintenance that never happened. The money just disappeared." With this new information in hand, Thomas Wright prepared a more aggressive legal strategy. He filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of several affected property owners, including not only the trespass issues, but also allegations of financial mismanagement. Susan Reynolds, feeling the siege closing in, tried one last desperate gambit. One morning in December, Michael woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. A construction crew was starting emergency maintenance work right on the disputed area of his property. "Stop immediately," Michael shouted, running outside still in his pajamas. "This is a direct violation of the court order." The situation attracted the attention of the neighbors, and soon a small crowd formed. Richard Knowles appeared with his camera documenting everything. The local sheriff was called to intervene, and the works were halted. "Mrs. Reynolds," declared Sheriff Johnson, "are you aware that you are violating a court order? This could result in serious consequences." The incident was the last straw. That same afternoon, a special council meeting was called. Brandon Martinez, supported by other council members, proposed a motion of no confidence in Susan Reynolds. "For years we have allowed a single person to control our community through fear and intimidation," Brandon declared. "That ends today." The vote was almost unanimous. Susan Reynolds was removed from her position as HOA director as she left the room, carrying her expensive leather briefcase and holding her head high. Michael couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. Her power had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, and now was all crumbling. The following weeks brought significant changes to the Oakwood community. A full audit was launched, revealing years of mismanagement and questionable decisions. The new board, led by Brandon Martinez, began implementing significant reforms to the HOA's governance. For Michael, the victory was bittersweet. His gas line was finally restored, and a formal agreement was established to regularize all the facilities that crossed his property. But the process had revealed a deeper truth about how easily power can corrupt even in a small suburban community. "You know," he commented to Thomas Wright as they watched the installation of the new gas meters, "I never imagined that a simple property dispute could reveal so much about human nature." Thomas smiled, adjusting his glasses. "That's why laws and contracts exist, Michael, to protect people not only from each other, but also from themselves." The snow was beginning to fall softly over Fairview, covering the traces of ancient battles with a peaceful white blanket. The Oakwood community was changing slowly, but surely into something more transparent and fair, and it all started with a man who refused to be intimidated, who chose to defend not only his property, but also his principles. The discovery of Janet Cooper's flash drive triggered a series of events that no one in the Oakwood community could have predicted. Michael Anderson and his lawyer Thomas Wright spent an entire night analyzing the financial files, revealing an elaborate embezzlement scheme that spanned more than a decade. "This goes way beyond ownership disputes," Thomas muttered, rubbing his tired eyes as he scrolled through endless spreadsheets. "We're talking about systemic fraud." The documents showed that Susan Reynolds had set up shell companies to provide maintenance services that were never carried out. The payments, always approved without question by the former council, amounted to more than $2 million over the years. Brandon Martinez, now leading the interim HOA board, called an emergency meeting to present the findings. The tension was palpable in the community room as he shared the details of the fraudulent transactions. "As an engineer, I can confirm that many of these services supposedly provided are technically impossible," Brandon explained, pointing to a series of invoices. "For example, this $50,000 maintenance on a non-existent drainage system." Sheriff Johnson, present at the meeting, was taking detailed notes. A criminal investigation now seemed inevitable. Richard Knowles, the investigative journalist, had begun publishing a series of reports exposing the scam, attracting the attention of the state media. Margaret Wilson, the former secretary, who had tried to destroy documents, sought Michael out at his home. One rainy evening, her face was marked by regret and fear. "I knew something was wrong," she confessed, sitting in Michael's kitchen with a cup of coffee trembling in her hands. "Susan threatened me. She said she would destroy my reputation if I said anything. I have a son in college. I couldn't risk it." Michael recorded the testimony of Margaret, who became a key witness in the investigation. She provided crucial details about how Susan manipulated council approvals and falsified documents. The Oakwood community was in shock. Informal meetings began to take place in residents' homes where stories of intimidation and abuse of power emerged. One after the other, Carol Bennett organized a support group for residents who had suffered retaliation from the previous administration. "It's like we're waking up from a collective nightmare," Carol commented during one of these meetings. "We were all afraid to speak out, to question." Susan created an atmosphere of terror. Meanwhile, Janet Cooper continued her meticulous analysis of the financial records. Each new discovery revealed deeper layers of corruption, offshore accounts, overpriced contracts, and even evidence of blackmail against other board members. "Look at this." Janet showed Michael a set of recovered emails. Susan kept a file with compromising personal information about each board member. This is how she kept everyone in line. The investigation began to affect other communities in the region. It was discovered that Susan Reynolds was involved in the management of several other HOAs through consulting firms. The scheme was bigger than anyone imagined. Thomas Wright worked tirelessly to organize the evidence into a solid case. "We need to make sure this never happens again," he explained during a strategy meeting. "It's not just about punishing those responsible, but about creating safeguards for the future." The impact on the community's finances was severe. Years of mismanagement and embezzlement had left the HOA's reserves virtually empty. Brandon Martinez and the new board faced the challenge of rebuilding not only the residents' trust, but also the association's financial health. "We're going to need a long-term recovery plan," Brandon explained during a general meeting. "But this time, every penny will be accounted for with complete transparency." The news of Susan Reynolds' arrest arrived on a winter's morning. Sheriff Johnson personally supervised the operation, which included searches of her home and office. The evidence found was impressive: false documents, digital storage devices with incriminating files, and a significant amount of cash. Michael watched from his window as Susan was escorted to the police car. Her face, once always marked by an expression of superiority, now showed only defeat. It was never really about power, Michael reflected to Janet, who was standing next to him. It was about greed and control. The Oakwood community slowly began its healing process. The new board implemented unprecedented transparency measures. All meetings were broadcast live, financial records were digitized and made available online, and an oversight committee was established with rotating representatives from the residents. Michael, although pleased with the outcome, knew that Oakwood's story would serve as a wake-up call for other communities. The fight for justice and transparency had cost time, energy, and resources, but the end result proved that what is right is worth fighting for sometimes. He said during an interview with Richard Knowles, "It only takes one person willing to stand up against injustice to inspire others to do the same." Spring arrived in Fairview, bringing not only the blooming of flowers, but also a wave of transformation in the Oakwood community. The Susan Reynolds trial had dominated local headlines for weeks, exposing a corruption scheme that extended far beyond the boundaries of the association. Michael Anderson watched from the balcony of his home as a new team installed informational signs along the border of his property, part of the transparency measures implemented by the new board. Brandon Martinez personally supervised the work, ensuring that each demarcation strictly respected the legal boundaries. It's amazing how something as simple as respecting boundaries can make such a difference, commented Brandon, approaching with a folder of documents. "The final audit report is here. You should take a look." The document revealed the full extent of Susan's schemes. In addition to the embezzlement already known, a network of connections with fraudulent contractors in 3 different states was discovered. The investigation had expanded to include other HOAs run by her, revealing a similar pattern of manipulation and fraud. Janet Cooper, now promoted to Oakwood's financial controller, organized a detailed presentation for the residents. The community hall was packed with attentive faces, absorbing every detail of the projected graphs and spreadsheets. "What we discovered," Janet explained, her firm voice echoing around the room, "wasn't just an isolated case of mismanagement. It was a system deliberately designed to exploit governance vulnerabilities in homeowners associations." Richard Knowles, who had turned the story into an award-winning investigative series, was furiously taking notes at the back of the room. His work had inspired similar investigations in other communities across the country, spawning a national movement for greater transparency in the management of HOAs. Marbert Wilson, rehabilitated as a key witness in the case, had established a support group for employees of HOAs who testify to wrongdoing. "The fear of silence is more damaging than the risk of speaking out," she often said at her meetings. Thomas Wright, analyzing the broader impact of the case, began working on legislative proposals with state congressmen. "The Oakwood case exposed systemic flaws in the regulation of HOAs," he explained during a video conference with legislators. "We need more robust protections for homeowners and more efficient oversight mechanisms." Oakwood's transformation has become a model for other communities. The new governance system implemented by Brandon included mandatory rotation of board members, quarterly independent audits, and an online portal where every expense was documented in real time. Carol Bennett, now leading the Residents Committee, organized a community event to celebrate the first anniversary of the changes. Families gathered in Oakwood Central Park, sharing stories and building new bonds of trust. "You know," said Carol, addressing those present, "we used to see our fences as borders of war. Now they're just lines on the map that help us be better neighbors." Michael, watching the celebration, reflected on how his personal battle had catalyzed a much bigger change. Patricia Henderson, the elderly resident who first exposed the old violations, approached him with her characteristic gait. "You've given us our voice back, dear." She smiled, her eyes shining with wisdom. "Sometimes it only takes one brave person to remind us that we can fight for what's right." The Oakwood case began to appear in academic studies on community governance and property rights. Universities invited Michael and Brandon to speak about transparency and reform in homeowners associations. During one of these lectures, a student raised a pertinent question. "How can we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. "The real protection is not just in laws and regulations, but in people's willingness to be vigilant and speak up when something is wrong." Silence is the greatest ally of the abuse of power. The impact of the case continued to reverberate. State legislators passed the Oakwood Act, setting new standards of transparency and accountability for HOA. Susan Reynolds, serving her sentence, had become an example of what happens when power is corrupted by greed. One quiet afternoon, while working in his home office, Michael received an unexpected email. It was from a community in Oregon facing a similar situation to the one he had experienced. Attached was a request for guidance and support. "Some battles," he muttered as he began to reply, "are worth fighting, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after." Oakwood's transformation continued day by day. The old wounds began to heal, replaced by a new sense of community and shared purpose. The case that started with a blocked gas line had turned into a movement for change and justice. As the sun set over Fairview, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Oakwood, Michael realized that some victories go beyond personal triumph. They become seeds of change planted in fertile soil ready to grow and inspire others to fight for a better future. The Oakwood story was no longer just about a property dispute or an exposed corruption scheme. It was a testament to the power of individual courage and the strength of collective action. It was a reminder that even in the smallest communities, the pursuit of justice can unleash waves of change that extend far beyond their original borders.